The House will be in order. The prayer will be offered by the guest chaplain, the Reverend Rob Hughes, Broadway Presbyterian Church, Sedalia, Missouri.
Let us pray. Awesome and merciful God, we thank you that we can approach you directly in prayer, fully aware that prayer is not a shield protecting us from all evil, but rather a reminder, first and foremost, that you alone are God, creator, redeemer, and sustainer of all, and we are not. Gracious Lord, in ancient times, King Solomon asked only for wisdom, not fame, fortune, or influence. Instead, he longed for godly wisdom, whether as parent, teacher, minister, elected official, or in any other position of leadership. Help us to lead with godly wisdom. Heavenly God, as I proclaim your threefold unity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, individual yet eternally united as one God, I pray that this nation, the United States, be also unified, respecting and valuing the individual, yet eternally united as one nation, under God, indivisible. It is in your name I pray. Amen.
The chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Brown.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Without objection, the gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Hartzler, is recognized for 1 minute.
Speaker, I rise today to honor and thank Reverend Robert Hughes of Sedalia, Missouri, for his leadership in the faith community. After beginning his career in film and television working for media companies like Disney and National Geographic, Reverend Hughes left show business to do God's business. He entered the ministry, which led him to Sedalia in Missouri's 4th Congressional District, where he serves as the pastor at Broadway Presbyterian Church. Reverend Hughes is well loved by the members of his congregation, and he uses his time and talents to energize others about God's Word. It is my honor to recommend him as guest chaplain to lead the House in prayer this morning. Reverend Hughes, thank you for your devotion to your community and congregation and for bringing inspiration and encouragement to those you serve. May God bless everything you set your hand to. Your service to God and your church is appreciated. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The chair will entertain up to 5 further requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does a gentleman from Georgia seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the bravery of one of my constituents and an American hero, Staff Sergeant Richard Hunter. Staff Sergeant Hunter was recently awarded the Air Force Cross in recognition of his outstanding courage in the line of duty. Staff Sergeant Hunter was deployed to Kunduz Province, Afghanistan, as part of the U.S. Army Special Forces team. On November 2, 2016, his team found themselves under heavy machine gun fire from insurgents. Despite the barrage of enemy fire, Hunter charged forward to shield the wounded and ultimately repelled the enemy's encroachment. He initiated the launch of the Quick Reaction Force and Casualty Airlift for wounded members in his group. After discovering an injured fellow Special Force soldier, Hunter dragged him 30 meters to safety with one hand while he directed radio airstrikes with his other. When they fell under fire once again, Hunter eliminated the threat and helped load the wounded into a helicopter to be evacuated. In total, Staff Sergeant Hunter's actions that day eliminated 27 enemy forces and saved his team. For these measures of extraordinary bravery in the most dire of circumstances, Staff Sergeant Richard Hunter earned the Air Force Cross Award. Without his help, many American service members surely would have been lost that day. Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues to join me in honoring the heroic actions of Staff Sergeant Richard Hunter, a true American hero. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Gentleman seeks unanimous consent. Yes. Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the tax bill put forth today by congressional Republicans is a gift to the wealthiest 1% and multinational corporations at the expense of our students, homeowners, and seniors. It eliminates critical deductions that help Central Coast families, including deductions for state and local taxes, mortgage interest, student loans, and medical expenses. With wildfires season in California growing longer each year, this bill callously eliminates tax relief for personal casualty losses resulting from wildfires as well as earthquakes. In fact, this bill would raise taxes on 36 working and middle-class taxpayers by an average of $1,130. With the national debt that has now surpassed $20 trillion, the American people cannot afford this tax bill that adds $1.5 trillion to the deficit and leaves our children stuck with the bill. Americans deserve bipartisan tax reform that simplifies our tax code and puts the middle class first. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hardworking families in Michigan have been squeezed for far too long under our broken tax code. Wages aren't going up, yet the cost of living keeps getting more expensive. We developed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act with those low and middle income families in mind. They need a break. Folks in Michigan, in Monroe, Jackson, Charlotte, and all across my district, this tax cut plan means bigger paychecks and more money in their pocket. At every income level, people will see meaningful tax relief. Our plan doubles the standard deduction and increases the child tax credit to help with the cost of raising a family. It also eases the tax burden on small businesses so they can give their workers a raise and create more jobs in the community. It brings back jobs from overseas and incentivizes job creators to expand and hire here at home. Mr. Speaker, this is a pro-growth and pro-worker plan. Let's pass it today and help the families we represent get the relief they need. And I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and, if necessary, to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the American people do not support the GOP tax plan being considered today. After promising a simple and fair tax system, Republicans offer a complicated mess. Their tax plan picks winners, the rich and big corporations getting nearly $1 trillion in tax cuts. They create losers like teachers, seniors, students, people with disabilities, and working families who will pay more. This GOP tax scam also targets our nation's veterans. More than 300,000 veterans have benefited from the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, most of whom served after 9/11. Yet this bill eliminates the tax credit and abandons our service members when they return home and transition to civilian life. Today, 1 of every 3 veterans is underemployed, and 1.8 million veterans are stuck in low-wage jobs. Every single veteran should be able to get a family-supporting job at home after serving our nation. This tax bill asks our veterans and their families to again sacrifice, this time so billionaires and big corporations get a huge tax cut. Mr. Speaker, veterans deserve a better deal, and so do American working families. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition? Without objection, gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have supported and will continue to support increased federal funding for the promising research going on at the National Institute of Health in order to encourage more progress. I'm addressing the Alzheimer's situation. November is not National Alzheimer's Disease Awareness Month. There are an estimated 5.5 million Americans living with this debilitating disease, and we know it often goes unreported or undiagnosed. This issue is near and dear to my heart because it has touched my own family, and I have seen firsthand the challenges of supporting a loved one battling the disease. I've been frustrated by the lack of progress. Again, Mr. Speaker, together we will improve the quality of life for those who are suffering and work towards finding a cure. We must have funding for the NIH to get this done. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent?
I seek unanimous consent, sir.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I rise to oppose the administration's proposed national parks interest fee hike from $25 to $70 per vehicle, which will prohibit many American families from enjoying these beautiful sights. Joshua Tree National Park in my district welcomes as many as 2.5 million visitors each year, contributing $128 million to our local economy. It is a haven for so many. Local veterans find solace and healing in the quiet of nature. Children experience the beauty of their first hike. Visitors come to love the grandeur and the mystic of our desert when they come to stay in Joshua Tree. Families bond over the lasting memories they make in the park. Everyone, not just the rich, should have access to these incredible places. Working families are deserving of access to our national parks. Nearly tripling the price of entry means that many families will be priced out of visiting these parks, including many people in my district who live right next to the Joshua Tree National Park. Our national parks are not just only for the economically privileged, they are for we the people to enjoy.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize the Bucks County Opportunity Council Community Action Agency, which serves low-income families throughout Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and its Economic Self-Sufficiency Program, which recently graduated its 300th family from poverty. This individualized program works with families to end the cycle of poverty by building a plan of action and working with a coach to attain new training and education. To graduate, participants in the program must be free from welfare subsidies, have secured employment, live in safe and affordable housing, have access to safe and reliable transportation, maintain a balanced budget, and have a health care plan for their entire family. Mr. Speaker, this program is working. Aside from the total number of graduates, last year's class of families have more than tripled their salaries. Moreover, in our community, every dollar invested nets nearly $5 saved in cash welfare subsidies. I'm proud to stand with the Bucks County Opportunity Council and their mission to reduce poverty and partner with our community to promote economic self-sufficiency. Our community is a better place because of their work. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as we stand here today, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will tell you that this tax scam bill will help ordinary people. Well, as we New Yorkers say, if you buy that one, I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. This bill takes a wrecking ball to our middle class. It erases deductions that ordinary working families count on to stay afloat. It raises taxes on 36 million middle-class families. By eliminating the medical expense deduction, this scam will force nearly 500,000 New Yorkers who already struggle with serious illnesses to dig into overstretched bank accounts just to pay their health care bills. By cutting the student loan interest deduction, higher education will become even more expensive for 800,000 New York students. Graduate students will be taxed on tuition waivers. I heard from one woman in my district, a recent PhD, who said she will have to pay $2,700 in income. The choice is clear. Vote no, reject this
Gentlelady's
scam.
time
I
has
yield back.
expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to encourage my colleagues all to support H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. For the first time since 1986, this is real opportunity to challenge the status quo and simplify the tax code. For the nearly 82% of taxpayers in the Pennsylvania's 5th Congressional District who filed jointly under the standard deduction, they're going to see that nearly doubled to $24,000, up from $12,700. According to the IRS, 18% of taxpayers in the 5th District of Pennsylvania choose to itemize their tax returns, averaging about $21,000 in deductions. Doubling the standard deduction means that low and middle income families who have been struggling for a long time will see their tax burden lowered. This proposal truly strives to help families keep more of their hard-earned paychecks. And today we have a choice. Today we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity that we cannot afford to pass up. More jobs, fairer taxes, bigger paychecks. The American people deserve no less, and I encourage my colleagues to support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 1, Republican tax bill, a giveaway to corporations and the richest 1%, a tax hike on working class Americans and their children. It is unconscionable as it cripples the state and local tax deductions. 30% of my residents will lose these deductions, average $17,000 per family, according to IRS, which will devastate housing affordability in my district and disadvantage California taxpayers compared to other states. It cruelly eliminates the medical expense tax deduction worth over $10,000. This is a direct blow to seniors and families in my district who have long-term medical needs, as well as families with children who have severe disabilities. House bill is terrible, but the Senate wants to include a repeal of the Affordable Care Act in their bill, making it even more painful for working families. This would kick millions of Americans off their health insurance plan, spike premiums, or undermine entire healthcare system. It also abolishes the tax-exempt status of private activity bonds used by San Gabriel Valley citizens, water agencies, transportation agencies to provide low-cost financing. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert to the record letters from the California League of Cities, California County, State of California, San Gabriel Valley Economic Partnership, in opposition to H.R. Urge my colleagues to vote against it.
Without objection. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 1 will now resume. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 302, H.R. 1, a bill to provide for reconciliation pursuant to Title II of the concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2018.
When proceedings were postponed on Wednesday, November 15, 2017, 1 hour and 58 and a half minutes of debate remained on the bill. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, has 1 hour and 1 minute remaining. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, has 57 and 1/2 minutes remaining. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, key architect of the tax reform plan and a leader, a champion for new business investment, Mr. Nunes.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. For years, the middle class has been saddled with a broken tax code and low wages. Small businesses have been crushed by overly complicated rules and a higher tax burden than corporations. As a result, America has suffered from a self-inflicted, uncompetitive tax code, lagging behind the rest of the world both in economic growth and job creation. Companies have fled for lower tax jurisdictions and more competitive business environments. Since the 1986 Tax Reform Act was passed, Washington has continued to make the tax code longer and more complicated, adding special interest loopholes and industry-specific carve-outs back into the code year after year. This has allowed the tax code to dictate business decisions instead of letting businesses dictate business decisions. For the first time in 31 years, we are wiping the tax code clean and replacing it with one that is fairer and simpler for everyone. For the better part of my career, I have advocated for a cash flow tax system that would allow small businesses to expense 100% of their costs immediately. H.R. 1 contains an expensing provision that would give businesses the tremendous opportunity to reinvest, allowing them to grow their businesses and create jobs. The impacts for the American economy would be huge. Small businesses across rural California, from the small family-owned farm to the neighborhood restaurant and any other entrepreneur, deserve a type of tax system that allows them to create jobs and be able to compete on an equal footing globally. Mr. Speaker, before I close, I want to say that, just point out to those in the audience, those that are watching this, that today you're going to hear a lot about how Republicans are giving tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires. Mr. Speaker, that is always what the left says about the Republicans. However, you also hear a lot of talk about people who itemize and SALT deductions and how those are somehow increasing taxes on the middle class. The reality of this, Mr. Speaker, is these deductions go to millionaires and billionaires. So for my friends on the left, you can't have it both ways. You can't claim that Republicans are giving tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires when you are attempting to keep the very tax cuts, the tax cuts called SALT, state and local tax deductions, that go to millionaires and billionaires. And with that, in closing, I want to take this opportunity to thank Chairman Brady and all my colleagues on the Ways and Means Committee. For years, we have been working on this legislation. But, Mr. Speaker, this is a historic moment. Congress has the opportunity to positively impact every American by reforming our tax code. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to yield myself 4 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 4
minutes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a historic moment, but most importantly, it's a missed opportunity. We are taking the proposal of the Republican Party today and the financial architecture of our revenue system based on their request to the casino. Their argument is premised on one thing today and one thing only: maybe. But what about maybe not? This could have been done between the two parties as we requested and wanted to do. In 1986, 450 witnesses offered testimony on tax reform. 30 hearings were held. The Secretary of the Treasury attended most of them, and the two parties found commonality in reaching an accord that was well received by the American people. But what we're being asked to do here today is to raise taxes on 36 million middle-class Americans. The previous speaker, my friend from California, a quarter of the households in his district claim the state and local tax deduction with an average of $10,000 per family. $10,000. So they're going to tell you today they're giving you this and they're giving you that and they're giving you this. Take a look at the distribution tables. That's the most certain opportunity for people to examine precisely what is in this legislation. Gentleman earlier this morning was heralding Alzheimer's Month. They give us an Alzheimer's tax during Alzheimer's Month. For those who stay together with loved ones for as long as they can, they need that deduction that is so important to keeping that family together. This is the same old, same old. In 2001, tax cuts of $1.3 trillion, all premised on maybe we'll have economic growth. Remember the argument that tax cuts pay for themselves? Well, today they call it dynamic scoring. So now we're being asked again to premise the argument on maybe there'll be enough growth to generate some return on revenue. So in 2003, another $1.3 trillion in terms of a tax cut was offered with no or slow economic growth. And the granddaddy of them all, in 2005, how about repatriation? Foreign earnings were brought back at 5.25%, all based upon the idea that there was going to be widespread, broad-based hiring. And what did we discover in the aftermath of that? Almost 20,000 layoffs in the weeks after it. The money was used for broad stock buybacks and dividends with no employment gains across the country. They keep telling us, well, you're going to get 3%, 4%, 5%, and the president says 6% growth. I want to find that economist who says we're going to get 6% growth. Most projections are that we are being asked here today to participate in the following, because this is the context of the argument this morning. They are borrowing $2.3 trillion over 10 years for the purpose of giving a tax cut to people at the very top of our economic system. We should be investing in human capital, community colleges, vocational education, internship programs, and aligning the American people with the skill sets that are necessary, as the Department of Labor reported this week, for the 6 million jobs that are available. That's the most gainful way to do long-term investment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I would note that family of four in Massachusetts' 1st District will see a tax cut of nearly $2,000 under this bill. And I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to one of our key leaders on Ways and Means, who's really all in on growth and savings for America, the gentlelady from Kansas, Ms. Jenkins.
Gentlelady from Kansas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. As a CPA and a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, reforming our tax code has been a priority of mine during my entire service here in Congress. Our current tax code's broken, and I've heard from thousands of Kansans in my district who are frustrated with the status quo. This legislation will not only reform our broken tax code, but it will permanently lower rates for hardworking individuals, families, and businesses, while retaining or expanding many popular provisions, such as the Dependent Care Assistance Program. It also includes strong safeguards that keep the wealthy from gaming the system in an effort to pay less than their fair share. On average, this legislation will help provide tax relief for all income groups across the board. If you don't believe me, read the analysis from the Tax Foundation and the Joint Committee on Taxation. They agree. And while individuals and families receive a much-needed tax break, they will also notice that their wages are going up and more jobs are being created. Just the other day, AT&T announced they will be making a substantial investment in the United States once we enact tax reform. Folks are tired of the status quo. They're tired of a tax code that is confusing, and once figured out, you realize that it actually penalizes hard work and success. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act accomplishes our goals of ensuring that rates are cut for lower and middle-income Americans, simplifying the tax system, and expanding American competition within the global economy. This is a rare opportunity to enact the kind of legislation that our constituents need and deserve to grow the economy and put more money in the pockets of hardworking Kansans. With that, I yield back the balance of my time and thank the chairman and the entire committee for their good work on this important legislation.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan who has a long and distinguished history in this Congress and as a member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Levin.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you for yielding, Mr. Neal, and for all of your work as we've done over the years. The Republican tax bill is built on massive deception. The deception is that, as the Speaker put it, quote, the focus is on middle-class tax relief. That is simply not true. As the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation said, roughly 1 out of every 4 Americans with income between $50,000 and $100,000 would pay higher taxes in 2023. And far overshadowing the $1,000 or so for other families. in 2019, those earning over $1 million would get an average tax cut of $73,000. Even as modified in last-minute desperation, the wealthiest would receive 90% of the new tax break for so-called pass-through income. Another deception is that tax breaks pay for themselves. On this, some people may have been in the past fooled once, fewer twice, but none thrice. A further deception is that exploding the deficit and national debt to $1.7 trillion will disappear as it promotes growth. Not only is this a 180-degree Republican turn, but it threatens Medicare and other critical programs and will worsen the vast inequalities in income and wealth in America. It is said that necessity is the mother of invention. In this case, Republican political necessity is the mother of desperation and deception. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I would note that the family of four, average family in Michigan's 9th District, will receive a tax cut of over $1,700. And I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to one of our key leaders, the Ways and Means Committee, who serves on Tax Policy Committee, Mr. Holding.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to be here today to support this historic bill that will put our economy back on the path to stable and sustained growth. This bill finally levels the playing field and restores the global competitiveness of American businesses by moving to a territorial system. This key aspect of our bill removes the punitive barriers of the current worldwide system and allows companies to reinvest their overseas profits in America without fear of getting hit with an excessive tax burden. This important change ensures that America remains the best place to start, grow, or invest in a business. As companies begin to see the benefits of this new territorial system, I look forward to continue to work with the chairman to explore ways to move towards a residency-based taxation system to ensure that American citizens have a level playing field around the globe as well. I've heard from companies, American companies, that say as they expand their operations overseas, the tax code has made it prohibitive for them to hire Americans for these jobs. And in fact, our current system of citizenship-based taxation makes Americans nearly 40% more expensive to employ overseas than their foreign counterparts. And I thank the chairman very much for his understanding of this issue and look forward to our continued work to ensure that talent, not tax burden, is a driving factor in the hiring decision of multinational companies. So thank you again, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to support this bill. I look forward to it growing the economy and ensuring that businesses of all sizes have the capital necessary to hire more employees, grow their operations, and give Americans the raise they deserve. And with that, I'm going to yield to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Holding. I want to thank you for your leadership on this issue, in particular about international competitiveness for our workers. So residence-based taxation is an idea we should continue to explore. We'll continue to work on this issue with you as leadership. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Lewis, who has the highest professional and personal esteem of every member of this institution.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my friend, Mr. Neal, for yielding. I rise with a heavy heart to join him in opposing this mean-spirit, reckless bill. Mr. Speaker, 30 years ago, I was elected to fight for and to serve the people of my district. Today, they are calling and begging for us to slow down and to do this the right way. In their hearts of hearts, the public knows that the safety net will be used to pay for this reckless corporate tax cut. Taxpayers know that this shameful bill destroyed the hopes and dreams of too many as it robbed the poor and especially poor Peter to pay wealthy Paul. That's not right. That's not fair. That's not just. You see, Mr. Speaker, you cannot hide the truth from the sick, the elderly, the disabled for whom this bill may mean life or death. You cannot hide the truth from the middle class, working and immigrant families who need every penny to make ends meet. You cannot hide the truth from teachers who try to lend a helping hand to students who struggle to get an education. And I, for one, refuse to hide the truth about this bill's attack on the separation of church and state. Mr. Speaker, as we abandon our constitutional duty and sacrifice our moral authority, I fear that history will not be kind to any of us. In another time and another period, members of Congress came together in a bipartisan fashion. They met, debated, and passed a tax bill that served the best interests of all people, not just a select few. They took their time, they did it right, and we should be doing it right. Today, the record must reflect the truth of this missed opportunity. H.R. 1 steal from our veterans, our seniors, our children, and for generations yet unborn. All taxpayers expect, demand, and deserve better, much better than legislation would put politics
Gentleman's
before the
time
good
has
of the
expired.
people. This bill is a shame and a disgrace.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to report that the average family for the 5th District of Georgia will see a tax cut of $1,484. With that, I'm pleased to yield 4 minutes to one of the new members of the Ways and Means Committee who's really been a leader for families and small businesses and industry, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the chairman for yielding and for his steadfast leadership and giving me the opportunity to be a part of this incredible opportunity on behalf of this great country. You see, tax reform is about giving hardworking Americans of all walks of life the confidence they need to make their dreams a reality. So the question that needs to be asked is whether or not the current tax code and all of its targeted tax credits really increase people's paychecks. Does it treat people fairly? Does it put American workers first? What about fostering economic growth? Does it help create more good-paying jobs? And on that subject, I think Michigan is a great case study, my home state of Michigan. You see, I'm from the Motor City, where we're known for our blue-collar work ethic. Our families come from humble beginnings. They get up every morning and go to work to make ends meet, to build a better life for their family and for the kids. And we've persevered through some pretty serious economic death spirals, I must say, very serious. And I would refer back to 2008 as an example. More than 8,000 people left our state. Just think about that. We're the only state in the union to lose population, and more would have left had they had a chance to sell their homes. At the time, I was the Senate Majority Leader under the last administration, overseeing the only Republican branch of government, and I saw firsthand how the administration pursued targeted tax credits, one after the other, that favored one industry over the other. It was a classic example of government picking winners over losers, and as expected, it failed miserably. As we see at the federal level today, in Michigan, these targeted tax benefits were paid for by everyone else in the form of tax increases. And not only did it fail to attract growth in emerging sectors as they had hoped, but it caused our economy to go into a tailspin, a very serious tailspin. Michigan quickly became the only state in the country experiencing zero economic growth. Per capita income fell for the first time, and it was one of the highest to begin with. Just a few later, it was one of the lowest. By 2009, unemployment hit a record high of 15%. Neighboring states that had more hospitable environments for job growth attracted our families and our neighbors. As I said, we're the only state in the union to lose population. But as Senate Majority Leader at that time of the only Republican branch of government, we didn't just say no to the government's failed policies. We offered solutions and loaded up the pipeline with legislation to help the newly elected Republican legislature and Governor Rick Snyder get the job done. What do? We did exactly what we're doing here today. We started with tax reform. While balancing budgets, we found ways to lower rates on individuals, reduce baseline rates for job creators, eliminated tax credits that favored certain industries over others. Michigan created an environment that grew the economy and helped families get ahead. And sure enough, just 2 months after these reforms happened, job growth turned positive again in Michigan. Today in Michigan, we are a top 10 pro-business state, ranked 12 among all states in overall business climate. Unemployment is the lowest it has been in my home districts at 3.3% in Livingston County. Detroit is reemerging again as an economic powerhouse. The streets are alive with entrepreneurs and young people finally living downtown. The future looks great for the comeback city. You see, the moral of the story is tax reform. But it's not just about tax cuts. It's about real reform to a broken system. Getting tax reform done right means delivering real relief, and I've seen it firsthand in Michigan. I know it can happen at the national level. It's not rocket science. It's about giving people back more of what that's rightfully theirs. It's about freeing up more capital to create more jobs, increase wages, and compete at the global level. This is how you grow an economy from the ground up. Let's vote for our constituents today. Do it for the middle income family of 4 or the struggling mom. Let's pass this bill today. It's been 31 years. It's time for relief. It's long overdue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under the Republican tax bill, 570,000 Michigan households earning less than $160,000 a year will see a tax hike. With that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, a thoughtful member of the Ways and Means Committee, and whose admonitions to all of us should be something we could all rally around. Mr. Thompson, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
I
for
rise
2
in
minutes.
opposition to this reckless and fiscally irresponsible bill that's going to add $2.3 trillion to our national debt. There's a reason why airports, universities, the Fraternal Order of Police, home builders, and veterans groups are opposed to this bill. It's because it will increase taxes on tens of millions of middle-class families. That's according to the Joint Committee on Taxation. One of the most heartless provisions would make it harder for middle-class families to rebuild after disaster. When you vote today, you're telling the survivors of the California fire that you don't care about them or about the middle-class families in your district who one day may face a tornado or a hurricane, all to save a few dollars so that we can give a tax break to corporations. We have a chance today to reject this bill, to come together, hold hearings and hear from experts, something that wasn't done when the Republicans wrote this bill. We can take ideas from both sides of the aisle and write a tax bill that helps middle-class working families. Let's reject this bill and work on real tax reform that will not raise taxes on the middle class and won't add $2.3 trillion. That's with a T, $2.3 trillion to our national debt. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased that the average family of 4 in the California's 5th District will see a tax cut of $2,300. I'm pleased to yield 4 minutes, 4 minutes to the gentleman from Florida who's been an advocate not only for Floridians but Puerto Rico and a number of our families and communities around the country, Mr. Curbelo.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This crucial legislation before us today marks the first time in 31 years Congress has considered a major overhaul to the current tax code that is overly cumbersome, wildly outdated, and riddled with special interest loopholes. Mr. Speaker, it's obvious there's a great deal of frustration and anxiety in our country. I truly believe it's due to the fact the economic recovery has not reached every household. Throughout South Florida, I hear from families and small businesses who are worried about saving for their kids' college or making payroll. While the stock market is humming and unemployment is low, wages have been stagnant, and the so-called recovery has left way too many people behind. And that's why this bill is so important. This legislation will collapse and lower current tax rates to ensure a typical middle-income family in South Florida will receive about $1,500 in tax relief. For married couples, it doubles the standard deduction from $12,000 to $24,000, drastically simplifying the process of filing taxes each year for over 90% of Americans, while allowing taxpayers to keep more of their hard-earned money. The bill also expands the child tax credit from $1,000 to $1,600 per child, a benefit that will be seen by 43,768 taxpayers in Florida's 26th district. And we're also making it easier to save for college by expanding 529 plans to cover more expenses, including apprenticeship programs. All these benefits will directly help alleviate the increasing cost of raising a family. On the business side, this bill gives American companies of all sizes, especially our smaller enterprises and entrepreneurs, a chance to compete and win in the new globalized economy. By providing businesses with lower tax rates, we will make it easier for our job creators to invest here at home and increase paychecks for American workers. Mr. Speaker, as a proud member of the Ways and Means Committee, I commend Chairman Brady, his staff, and the members of this House who will soon support this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to ensure we provide all Americans, especially the most vulnerable, the opportunity to find their economic success. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I request to engage in a colloquy with the Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee.
Gentleman is recognized for purposes of a colloquy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chairman Brady, I want to thank you for working with me to begin addressing the important issue of helping our fellow American citizens in Puerto Rico. After the devastating effects of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, our committee delivered immediate results for the island through a disaster tax relief package targeted to help people get back on their feet. And while it will take at least months for the island to fully recover, we are providing even more assistance to Puerto Rico with the legislation being considered today. I want to thank you for helping us extend the rum cover over to $13.25 per proof gallon to be paid back to the treasuries of both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands through 2023. I'm also grateful that under this bill, companies operating in Puerto Rico can deduct income attributable to domestic production activities retroactively for the year 2017. Moving forward, I'm hopeful we can work together to find creative solutions to better target the child tax credit to serve more Puerto Rico families and study the expanded use of the earned income tax credit for the Commonwealth. In addition, I look forward to continuing to work on solutions to ensure the businesses operating on the island have the certainty they need in terms of tax planning to hire more workers and strengthen Puerto Rico's economy. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
22,000 constituents for the gentleman from Miami will eventually face the Alzheimer's tax increase that is included in this legislation. With that, I want to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Connecticut, a neighbor, very thoughtful member of the Ways and Means Committee, and a really nice guy, Mr. Larson.
Gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
Before I begin, I seek unanimous consent to submit the following letters for the record. First, I'd like to submit a letter from the Commissioner of Revenue Services in the state of Connecticut, who has detailed out the impact of this tax on Connecticut residents. Second, I'd like to also insert for the record 20-plus letters from a cross-section of constituents who are directly and adversely impacted by this tax increase. I'd also like to submit a transcript of an interview with our esteemed Chairman Kevin Brady and Heidi Prisbella that appeared on Morning Joe. Also, for the record, I'd like to submit a letter from the AARP, who is in opposition to this bill. And lastly, for the record, Mr. Speaker, a letter from the Congressional Budget Office, which details out the other shoe to fall in this legislation. Thank you. So let me begin by preempting our distinguished chairman and for the record stating that a middle-class family in the state of Connecticut from West Hartford with a combined income of $125,000 with a mortgage and a kid in college, according to the Joint Committee on Tax, and to the Department of Revenue Services in the state of Connecticut will see a tax increase of $767 next year. And then with the clever clawback provision, that Grover Norquist kind of clawback provision that gives with one hand and takes away with the other, in 2023, that hard-working family in the middle class will see a $1,667 increase. So why are we here? Well, it's pretty easy to figure out this. I mean, these are honorable people, but sometimes they're called upon to do a political task, or as Mr. Collins put it, my donors are basically saying, get it done or don't ever call me again. Speaking of New York, my colleagues in New York and New Jersey, because we're donor states and because we make itemized deductions, find ourselves in a situation where we're paying double taxation. Don't take our word for it. Just ask a member of your own caucus. Ask Peter King, who describes this as the most massive redistribution of wealth at the expense of teachers and machinists and people who are of the professional class who you have found that you want to tax their success. But what adds insult to injury, above all else, aside from being a donor state and double taxation, is the cruelest cut. You know, we take a pledge of allegiance, we pledge allegiance to the Constitution, but some of you pledge allegiance to Grover Norquist. And in doing so, you want to make sure that you can shrink Social Security and Medicare up so small you can drown it in the bathtub. And that's what this does, a $25 billion that will come out of it.
Time has expired. Members are advised to direct their comments to the chair. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yielding myself 30 seconds, I would note that families in Connecticut's first district will see an average tax cut of $3,858 and grow jobs by 11,000 jobs. Mr. Corbello, you and resident Commissioner Gonzalez-Colon have been tireless advocates for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. I appreciate the hard work you've done to help our fellow citizens on the island. I agree. This tax reform bill is a good first step, and I look forward to working with you on ideas to best serve the people on this island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I reserve. Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to yield 2 minutes to one of the most thoughtful members of Congress and a leader in the field of renewable energy, my friend from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from 17 environmental organizations opposing this legislation.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Donald Trump is going to be on Capitol Hill rallying Republicans to vote for his tax bill, perfectly designed for his benefit, eliminating the alternative minimum tax, one of the few ways he pays any tax at all. Abolishing the inheritance tax, allowing him to pass on tax-free hundreds of millions of dollars to his family. Expanding access to the lower pass-through tax rates for many large and profitable businesses, Donald Trump lists hundreds of pass-through entities on his financial forms. Donald Trump is the king of debt, and this monstrosity of a tax bill is fueled by increasing the national debt $2.3 trillion. Cutting taxes for the wealthy, financed by increased debt burden on our children and grandchildren. And of course, details are starting to leak out, special deals for baseball teams. Breaking a bipartisan commitment to the wind energy industry is already causing their stock prices to fall, jeopardizing billions of dollars of projects and putting tens of thousands of jobs at risk, with the only retroactive provision in the bill breaking a bipartisan commitment that many of us worked on with the energy industry. The Republican proposal showers riches on the wealthiest Americans and most profitable corporations who are not going to create jobs and raise wages. What they're going to do is buy things and make more money. What is going to happen is that in the years ahead, taxes are going to raise for millions of Americans and even more in the future. Now, this tax perhaps has the most cruel element what I call the Alzheimer's tax, repealing the medical expense deduction used by over 9 million middle-class Americans who saved almost $90 billion in 2015. Gone. This stunning action places additional burdens on many elderly and vulnerable middle-income Americans trying to plan ahead for the crushing financial burden dealing with Alzheimer's. We never had a hearing on anything like this. It wouldn't stand the light of day. The American public will be cranky about this.
Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to report families, a 4 average family in Oregon's 3rd District will see a tax cut of $2,200. I'm really pleased to yield 1 minute to a dear friend of mine and the chairman of the Financial Services Committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Henserling.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, for almost a decade, Americans suffered under Obamonomics. Their savings remained decimated, their paychecks were stagnant, and their American dreams were diminished. But, Mr. Speaker, a new day has dawned. Under the leadership of President Trump and Speaker Ryan and Chairman Brady, we are on the precipice of passing a fair, flatter, simpler, more competitive tax code, one built for 3% plus economic growth. The American people can now imagine a tax code that brings jobs and capital back to America. They can imagine a tax code that's simplified from 70,000 pages to 500, where 90% of Americans can fill out their return on a postcard. They can imagine a tax code swept of all the special interest loopholes. They can imagine a tax code creating lower rates for working Americans in small businesses, and they can now imagine a tax code that's all about economic growth. And all my friends on the other side of the aisle can offer is the politics of division, envy, and class warfare. I'm proud to support the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act because it's all about better jobs, fair taxes, and bigger paychecks.
Gentleman's time has expired. Both sides have 44 minutes remaining in this debate. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 17,000 people in Mr. Henserling's district will now pay higher interest on their student loan deductions. With that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, great advocate of the heartland of America, Mr. Kind.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, of all the policy changes that are being recommended in this legislation before us today, the one that scares me the most is the repeal of the so-called Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment basically says if you're a religious organization or a nonprofit, and if you engage in partisan political activity, you lose your tax-exempt status. Repealing that has the potential of politicizing the pulpit nationwide. In fact, 103 religious organizations, 4,200 faith-based leaders in this country, 5,500 nonprofits have written a letter to every member of Congress telling us, don't do this. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask unanimous consent to have these letters inserted in the record at this time.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, when I go to my church, South Beaver Creek Lutheran Church, Sunday mornings with my family in rural western Wisconsin by our family farm, I view that place as a sanctuary for my soul, a place for us to congregate and commune, spend time in fellowship with our fellow neighbors, check up on one another. Yes, preach values, preach moral lessons to our children, absolutely. But by repealing the Johnson Amendment, you have the potential of creating conflict in the pews. You could be creating Republican and Democratic churches and mosques and synagogues overnight. And this is one of the last refuges, one of the last institutions that we still have as a country, given how much we are self-segregating and deciding who we like to hang out to, what clubs we join, what people we want to associate, even our own family members because of political affiliation. Our places of worship are one of the last places we can come, regardless of political affiliation. This will create unnecessary strife and unnecessary conflict and has the potential of driving young people away from organized religion because they won't put up with this. And it could be a backdoor attempt for a lot of political contributors now to get tax-exempt contributions to these organizations for direct partisan political campaigns. That's why the Joint Committee on Taxation viewed this as a cost of over $2 billion. I ask my colleagues to reconsider and reject this, and let's prevent that conflict in our communities. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to announce that the families of 4 average in the 3rd District of Wisconsin will see a tax cut of over $2,000. I'm really honored to yield 1 minute to the chairman of the Small Business Committee and the champion for small business, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shevin.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I rise in support of H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. As a result of this bill, Ohio families will keep more of what they earn, and additionally, it will create tens of thousands of jobs in Ohio and tens of thousands of jobs in other states all across the country. As chairman of the House Small Business Committee, I want to make sure that the tax code works for our nation's job creators so we can create jobs, not against them. 70% of the new jobs created in the American economy nowadays are created by small businesses. But unfortunately, small businesses are getting killed by the existing tax code. This tax code will bring rates down from approximately 40% for small business owners down to, in many cases, 25%, and in a lot of cases, 9%. From 40% down to 9%. That's going to mean small businesses can keep that money, invest, create more jobs for more Americans. Now, the naysayers around here obviously can't say enough bad about this bill, but it's going to be good for America. I urge my colleagues to support it.
From Massachusetts.
1/3 of the gentleman's constituents claim the state and local tax deduction, totaling $11,684 per family. With that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Paterson, New Jersey, a great friend to all of us here in the institution, Mr. Pasquale.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to enter 2 things into the record with your permission.
Without objection.
One is a letter from the Fraternal Order of Police representing 330,000 police officers in this country coming out against this bill because it'll affect their members in a very, very terrible way. And the other is an article in the New York Times today, which I submit for the record, Republican tax plans for corporations over people. Mr. Speaker, if I may.
Actually, the chair would advise both sides for matters submitted for the record to limit the editorial content or risk being charged for the time. Gentleman is recognized.
If it wasn't bad enough, Mr. Speaker, and I come over on this side for a reason. I got many brothers and sisters who I love here. But this is a terrible bill. Unanimous consent here. The real price of this bill is hidden. $30 billion in interest on the debt every year. Who pays this? If it weren't bad enough, the taxes that people have to pay today, and our children and our grandchildren, beyond that, the real price of this bill is further hidden. Temporary family flexibility credit expires after 5 years. Temporary exclusion for independent care costs expires after 5 years. Some have estimated that if Republicans make these provisions permanent, as they claim they'll happen in future Congresses, the cost of the bill will increase to over $400 billion. The Senate bill cuts off relief for families in 7 years. They're hiding over $500 billion in cost. I'm particularly interested in the SALT exclusion as a deduction. Folks in New Jersey, California, Maryland, New York, Connecticut, et cetera, they're going to be paying because of this deduction being removed. You can't make this up. In fact, the increase mostly comes from eliminating the state and local taxes deduction for individuals, but corporations can continue to deduct their state and local taxes. You can't, Mr. and Mrs. America. I hear you.
From Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is not just about tax reform. Today is also about what we fundamentally believe as a nation. Today, we say working class families, not the government, are best equipped to make financial decisions. Did we hear anything from our Democrat friends for nearly 8 years about lowering taxes on middle and lower income? We did not. Now, for the first time since 1986, we are going to overhaul our broken tax code. Here's what it means for families in North Carolina. Middle-income families will see more than $2,300 increase in their take-home pay. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act means more than 30,000 new jobs in North Carolina. I am encouraged that our Senate colleagues have also decided to include the Obamacare individual mandate repeal and would urge our House conference to consider as well. Last, I would like to thank Chairman Brady. There's no greater servant in the United States House. Thank you to his work, to his team. Today, we keep our promise. It's time to move forward. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, a thoughtful member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Doggett.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the promise of tax reform has degenerated into little more than a scam to aid tax dodgers. While public attention is diverted to scandal in Alabama, Republicans are rushing through this sham of a bill developed in the dark with lobbyists before most Americans realize what's about to hit them in the face. Instead of more jobs at home, Republicans create a giant new gaping loophole to ship ever more jobs abroad. Even Speaker Ryan's home state Republican Senator, Ron Johnson, concedes that under this bill, quote, there will be a real incentive to keep manufacturing overseas. Hardly a surprise, since President Trump's Wall Streeter, designated to run this show, has just been identified personally from leaked Bermudan documents as the past executive of not one, but 22 different island tax paradise shell companies. Meanwhile, another loophole carried interest that flows to plutocrats like Donald Trump. That's the very injustice he promised last year to stop. Well, it'll keep flowing right into his pocket. But as for the deduction for student interest, for those that are overwhelmed with college loans, well, like other middle-class tax provisions, that's part of the $65 billion that is cut out of tax incentives by Republicans in this bill. They're totally dependent upon alternative facts. But today's bill even authorizes those who want to pay absolutely zero in tax that they can do it by abolishing the alternative minimum tax. That one change that they make in 1 year would have put $31 million in Donald Trump's pocket. So you can certainly understand why he's coming to the Capitol today, just to say thank you. Thank you for the $1 billion plus that is estimated to go to the Trump family under this bill. When does my tax refund get here, he must be saying. But of course, we don't know precisely how much Donald Trump is enriched because these Republicans keep colluding to hide his tax returns. Republicans want to apply a dynamic score to this bill. I say create a dynamic workforce. Invest in people. Don't overwhelm us with endless debt. Develop a more competitive, healthy workforce that empowers our dreamers and other immigrants, that gives every American access to education and skill upgrades to achieve their full God-given potential. As they deny one middle-class deduction after another and impose this new Alzheimer's tax, Republicans claim that they have a patented tax miracle cure for most everything but baldness. Well, we've seen this traveling trickle-down medicine.
This gentleman is recognized for an additional 15
We've
seconds.
seen this trickle-down medicine sideshow before. It didn't work then. It won't work now. All they're doing is grabbing for a political life preserver after 10 months of Republican failures, but leave America drowning in debt. This isn't tax reform. It's a giant giveaway to Washington's special interests that must be stopped.
Gentleman's time has expired. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My late father was the ranking Republican on the House Ways and Means Committee when the last major tax reform was passed in 1986. I know personally how difficult it was then to bring all the competing interests together. Everything looks easy from a distance. Everyone in this Congress would write a slightly different tax bill if given the chance to do so, but we can't have 535 different tax bills. Probably even Chairman Brady would change some things if he had complete control over it. I would favor some slight differences, but this is a great bill overall for middle-income people. We need to do more in the future to cut spending, though, along with it. Kevin Brady is the right man at the right time, and I think he has done a masterful job in bringing this bill to the floor. No other bill will do more to help keep jobs in this country. No other bill we could pass in this Congress will do more to help more people than this one will. I urge its passage. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, whose knowledge of New Markets tax credits is second to none in this institution.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record 2 letters, one from the National Education Association and one from the American Council on Education.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Republican tax bill is a dangerous bill that raises taxes on 36 million middle-class households, takes health care from tens of millions of Americans, skyrockets the cost of health insurance for all Americans, but especially for those who are sick and have pre-existing conditions, and directly results in cuts to Medicare and safety net spending next year, all to give corporate special interests immediate, permanent, and monumental tax cuts. Cut, cut, cut is all that I've heard this week. Cut the safety net. Cut service for the needy. Cut service for the physically challenged. Cut the poor. Cut the homeless. Cut Medicaid. Cut education. Cut out low-income tax credits. Cut out new market tax credits. Cut out social services. Cut block grants. Cut student loans. Winter is here. Cut the low-income energy assistance program. And if you live in Chicago, Minneapolis, in the Midwest, or the Northeast, without any heat, you're subject to catch pneumonia and die. There is no doubt about it. And so I can imagine that college presidents, hospital administrators, managers of programs are wringing their hands, wondering what are they going to do. Well, I heard a minister last Sunday at one of the churches in my community answer. He said, pray, pray, organize, organize, vote, vote, and vote against this bill.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee, gentleman from Florida, Mr. Buchanan.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I also want to acknowledge our incredible chairman, his leadership over the last, I've been here 7 years, but working this plan forward, so it's an exciting time for all of us. I rise today in support of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, legislation to provide tax relief to middle-class families and small business owners across America. As a businessman for more than 30 years, I've had the opportunity to employ thousands of workers. I've seen firsthand how broken our tax system can be for many hardworking Americans. Under this bill, not only will the average family of four receive a tax cut, but small businesses will finally be taxed at a lower rate to help them expand and grow jobs in America. According to the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, this bill will create 1 million new jobs and grow the economy by 4%, a growth rate this country hasn't experienced since 2000. It's time to give all Americans a break in terms of their taxes. With passage of this bill, we'll finally have the opportunity to help middle-class families and get our economy back on track. I yield back to the remainder of my time and urge support for this critical bill to cut taxes and reform our tax system.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, and with that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to one of the most knowledgeable members of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Higgins.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is nothing more than a hit job on middle America to pay for a massive tax cut for corporate America. income inequality and exploding budget deficits. When you take away tax relief from sick people who are born into illness, for whom insurance doesn't provide enough coverage, that is a hit on middle America. When you remove help for people who are just trying to make college affordable, who are trying to make themselves better, that is a hit on middle America. And when you take away health care for 13 million Americans and raise the cost for millions more, because you needed another $300 billion to give more to corporate America, that is a hit on middle America. And when 152,000 people from my community and millions more from New York lose 100 years of protection from state and local taxes, protection worth more than $8,000 per household, that is a hit on my community, it is a hit on New York State, and it is a hit on each and every community in America. And when you take away the essential needs of middle America to feed the rapacious needs of corporate America, it is a hit on fundamental fairness. And that, Mr. Speaker, is a hit on all of America.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Kramer.
Gentleman from North Dakota is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that the economic and job creation benefits are key components of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, making the U.S. globally competitive again, giving a much-needed tax cuts to American business and much-needed wage increases to American workers. But, Mr. Speaker, it's really the long overdue direct tax benefits to the vast middle class who don't have a lobbyist living in the rich suburbs of Washington, D.C. that takes center stage for me and my fellow North Dakotans. You see, 80% of the citizens of North Dakota file claiming this standard deduction. That means, Mr. Speaker, that the vast majority of my constituents will see their deductions nearly doubled if they do nothing else. And obviously, with the doubling of the standard deduction, it'll likely inspire even more North Dakotans to claim this simple deduction. Mr. Speaker, this huge benefit, combined with greater job opportunities and simpler and less expensive filing costs, and of course a generous family tax credit, will put more money in the pockets and less anxiety in the hearts of middle-class North Dakotans. Supporting this reform package is easy for me because it's right for North Dakota, and I thank Chairman Brady for his outstanding work.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Washington, a very successful businesswoman in her own right and understands the modern economy, Ms. Del Bene, for 2 minutes.
Gentlelady from Washington is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. In this Ryan McConnell tax bill, Republicans are touting the largest set of corporate tax cuts in our country's history. They're raving that their corporate cuts will create jobs, even though we know that trickle-down economics has never worked and never will. Instead of bringing Democrats and the public into the process, Republicans have made the most cynical trade-offs, only hurting people who need help the most. This is wrong. Tax reform should be about coming together and making choices that reflect our values. Yet under this plan, teachers who buy supplies for their students, like pens, pencils, and paper, will lose the ability to deduct those costs from their tax returns, but corporations still can deduct supply costs. Firefighters will no longer be able to deduct their state and local income or sales taxes, but corporations still can. Homeowners will no longer be able to deduct all of their property taxes, but corporations still can. And if workers have to move because their employer is forcing them to relocate their families or lose their jobs, they will no longer be able to deduct their moving expenses, but corporations, even those offshoring jobs, still can. This bill increases taxes on 36 million working families and rips away key lifelines that help people struggling with long-term illness, child care, and education expenses. It blows a $1.5 trillion hole in the deficit and burdens our children and grandchildren with debt, triggering an automatic $25 billion cut to Medicare. This bill gives massive permanent tax cuts to corporations, but working families will have to live with the temporary scraps thrown at them. Bottom line, this bill hurts Americans from cradle to retirement, and I urge my colleagues to vote no. I yield back.
Please yield 5 minutes to one of the leaders of the Tax Policy Subcommittee, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank Chairman Brady and all the members of the Ways and Means staff. You have worked tirelessly in order to bring this bill forward. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here today. And my friend Mr. Larson, I notice he wears a pin with the picture of John Kennedy, one of my favorite presidents of all time. Let me just read from a speech that President Kennedy gave December the 14th, 1962. This is 55 years ago, and he gave it in an address to the Economic Club of New York. Our true choice is not between tax reduction on the one hand and the avoidance of larger federal deficit on the other. It is increasingly clear that no matter what party is in power, so long as our national security needs keep rising, an economy hampered by restrictive tax rates will never produce enough revenues to balance our budget, just as it will never produce enough jobs or enough profits. Only full employment can balance the budget, and tax reduction can pave the way to that employment. The purpose of cutting taxes now is not to incur a budget deficit, but to achieve the more prosperous, expanding economy, which can bring a budget surplus. Keeping that in mind, and I hear the debate going back and forth, and I would just encourage all of our members, you are going to have a choice today to take your voting card, and you're going to put it in the voting machine, and you can push a green button that says go, putting this nation back on track, making America the greatest economic power in the world. Or you can push a red button and say, you know what, just not something I can vote for today because it's just not exactly what I want. Next week, 50 million Americans will travel because they want to come home. They want to come home for the holidays. They want to come home for Thanksgiving. This bill is a Thanksgiving bill. This is a jobs bill, because what we're telling corporate America is we want you to come home. We want to make this a more favorable environment for you to live, to work, to succeed, because we know the true success in business is only a sustainable business model. So when you tax people with the highest rate in the industrialized world, when you regulate people that puts them in an uncompetitive advantage on the shelf, they can't exist. And so where do they go? They have to leave home to go overseas to find that answer. Now, I just want to go over some things that really are important. A friend of mine by the name of George Abraham is a basketball coach, and George and I were talking one day, and we were talking about the value of winning. And George said to me, you know what, Mike? The only position you want to be in is the number one position. And I said, really? He goes, yes. Because anything other than finishing first is you finish with the rest. If you were to take a survey, and Forbes did, and they said, if you were starting a business today, where would you start that business? And right away I would say, are you kidding me? It's the United States of America because of who we are, our greatness. And no, there's 22 other countries that people say, I would rather go someplace else than do it right here in America. That is incredible. And when we talk about where we are as a people, listen to these figures. These are not my figures, by the way. This is a tax foundation. Cuts for Americans at every economic level. Reduces taxes by almost $1,200 for every average-sized middle-income American family. Reduces taxes by almost $2,000 for every average-sized middle-income family in Pennsylvania's 3rd District. Grows national GDP by 3.5%. Increases American wages by 2.7%. Increases after-tax incomes for every taxpayer by 3.8% in the long run. Increases after-tax incomes for median families in Pennsylvania by over $2,300. And it creates almost 900,000 new American jobs. And it will create, in my state of Pennsylvania, over 36,000 new jobs. So I say this is a jobs bill. This is a revenue raiser for us. This is about bringing people back home. This is about more take-home pay for every hard-working American guy and gal who's out there that gets up every day and gets up to do one thing, and that is to protect their families and work in the best interest of their country. I'm just asking you today to look at this card and know that you have, within the power of your vote, to unleash the greatest economy in the world, to unshackle it from a tax code that makes it impossible to compete globally, that overregulates it and forces it offshore and then blames them for leaving. This is a come on back home. This is don't leave home, stay here. We're on your side. We're going to work with you and we're going to get there. And so I asked my friends on both sides of the aisle, let's do what's right for America. If it's right for America, it's right for Republicans, it's right for Democrats, it's right for independents, it's right for libertarians, it's right for America. This is the right time to do the right thing. My friends, we cannot stay where we are. A stand-pat hand is a non-winning hand. The ability to move forward, the ability to absolutely not just participate in a global economy, but dominate a global economy and give every single American the faith in the future and restore the faith that they need to have in this body that we are doing the best thing in their interest every single day that we come here. And thank you, Chairman, and I yield back.
Members are reminded to direct their comments to the chair. The chair will now receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed S. 807, an act to provide anti-retaliation protections for antitrust whistleblowers.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to have Mr. Kelly, as he describes sports teams. We've discovered he's a closet Patriots fan. With that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, whose history in terms of revenue and revenue collection is well known to the Congress. Ms. Chu, for 2 minutes.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
One thing is clear about the GOP tax scam. Corporate interests get a huge giveaway. They get a windfall tax break. Who pays for it? The middle class. Who wins? Corporations, billionaires, millionaires, the Trump family. Who loses? Women, families, seniors, teachers, students. As a former Los Angeles Community College teacher of 20 years, I can't believe what Republicans are doing to students. They rip away critical benefits that help our students pay for their college education. They eliminate the student loan interest deduction and choose to tax graduate students on money they've never even received by taxing the tuition assistance they get for working for their schools. This bill even pinches students when they're still in elementary school by taxing their teachers who claim a deduction for the school supplies they pay for out of their own paycheck. One teacher in my area even pays for the ink in her classroom printer. They don't ask to be repaid, just to be able to deduct the expense. If corporations get to keep this deduction, why not our teachers? And then, if that's not cruel enough, they eliminate the deduction for extraordinary medical expenses for those with Alzheimer's and cancer. And this week we learned that Republicans plan to pay for these corporate cuts by causing 13 million people to lose their health insurance, a move that will increase premiums by 10% and result in individuals with pre-existing conditions losing access to life-saving, affordable coverage. And then Republicans eliminate the state and local tax deduction, which is used by over 6 million California households to prevent their hard-earned dollars from being taxed twice. Of all the states, California will actually face the largest net tax increase from this bill of $12.1 billion in 2027 alone. California Republicans who vote for this bill ought to be ashamed of themselves, and the voters need to hold them accountable. 36 million middle-class families will be stuck holding the bag under this plan. For what? For tax cuts, for corporate interests. This is unacceptable.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to one of our key members of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Renacci.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. First of all, I want to thank President Trump for making this a priority, but I especially want to thank Chairman Brady for his tireless efforts and leadership in bringing this legislation to the floor today. 3 decades, there was a 24-year-old starting a business in Ohio. He borrowed money and started hiring people. As he grew his business, he didn't take a paycheck and kept hiring hardworking middle-class Americans. But then, as he started looking over things, he couldn't hire any more because of a tremendous tax bill owed to the federal government. That's what small business entrepreneurs face in today's tax environment. That 24-year-old was me. Luckily, I was a certified public accountant. I was able to figure out a way to make my business work and grow without our suffocating tax code, or through our suffocating tax code. Unfortunately, most small business owners do not experience the tax code complexities until they get started. They have an idea, they start their business, and then the government steps in, and they're not CPAs. And my 3 children were to ask me today if they would risk if they should risk and start a business, I would be hesitant to push them down that path. Which is why I support H.R. 1, which lowers the tax rate for businesses and gives hardworking taxpayers a break. This bill puts more money in their pockets to do with it what is important to them, those hardworking taxpayers, not letting the government take it and waste it. Lowering the individual rate will give Americans the opportunity to choose where they want to spend their money, instead of banking on a government to spend it for them. On the business side, the harsh reality is that America has become an uncompetitive place to do business. With the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world, it should not be a surprise that businesses are relocating to countries with better business climates. Fortunately, by bringing the rate down to 20%, we can make America one of the most competitive countries in the world to do business. It's hard for U.S. companies to compete against companies based in Canada, where the federal income tax rate is 15%, Ireland at 12.5%, or even UK, which will be 17% by 2020. Businesses set their prices to be competitive. The U.S. has to set its business rate to compete as well. The high corporate tax rate is not just a Wall Street problem, it's a Main Street problem. Business entities do not pay taxes, people do. The burden of the corporate tax rate falls on three categories of people: shareholders, customers, and employees. Corporations do not pay taxes, we do. This bill helps companies compete and hire more people and give them a more competitive wage. This bill gives individuals more money to spend on what they want, not what the government wants. This bill simplifies the tax code for hardworking Americans. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this historic reform so more Americans can choose where their money goes, not Washington. I urge passage of H.R. 1 and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Alabama, Marshall Scholar and Attorney Ms. Sewell.
Gentlelady from Alabama is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge my colleagues to reject this misguided and mean-spirited tax bill that's being rushed through this Congress today. Mr. Speaker, this Republican sham tax bill picks winners and losers. The winners under this tax bill are corporations, Wall Street fat cats, the 1% of the highest wage earners in America, and the special interests. The losers are the middle class, working families, students, and the most vulnerable in our societies, our farmers. I'd like to submit for the record, Mr. Speaker, a letter from the Farm Union, the National Farmers Union, which objects to this bill.
Without objection.
Yes, these are the very same people that this president promised to benefit. This is what this bill does for corporate America. It dramatically cuts rates from the largest companies in the world, moving the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20%. It creates loopholes for wealthy individuals to characterize their wage income as small business income so that they can pay less taxes. It repeals the alternative minimum tax, which captures the tax liabilities for wealthy individuals. In fact, the only tax return that we've ever seen of Mr. Trump was his 2005 tax return, in which he had to pay $38 million. Why? Because of AMT. This tax bill will also permanently repeal the estate tax, which only affects 5,500 households in America. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, none of those households are in my district. In contrast, how will this tax bill impact the middle class? Well, Mr. Speaker, 36 million middle-class households will pay more taxes. 1 in 4 taxpayers will pay more taxes. And to pay for these corporate tax cuts, this bill will hurt working families. It will eliminate deductions on interest for student loans. It will eliminate medical expense deductions, which many households use to pay for long-term care needs. It will eliminate the lifetime learning credit. It will also do away with deductions for families that pay for daycare and aging parents. Mr. Speaker, this is not comprehensive tax reform. The American people deserve better, and we as a Congress can do better. Please reject this bill.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Messer.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Chairman Brady for his leadership. Today is a huge victory for working Americans. Today we take a giant step forward to deliver more jobs, fairer taxes, and bigger paychecks for working Hoosiers. This bill will create thousands of jobs in Indiana, and it will give the typical working family a $1,500 tax cut. The Trump tax plan also includes a provision that I authored to stop $4 to $7 billion in refundable child tax credits paid out to illegal immigrants each year. These savings help expand the child tax credit for working American families by $600 per child. Hoosiers get it. No one should get a tax incentive to violate the law. I urge all of my colleagues to support this plan. It will give working Hoosiers a pay raise, bring back jobs from overseas, and get our economy moving again. I also urge the Senate to act and keep their promise to the American people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield to Congressman Lewis for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank Mr. Neal for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to submit an article about this bill's impact on graduate students in my district into the record. Mr. Speaker, I further ask unanimous consent to submit letters of opposition from the ACLU, Baptist Joint Committee, and American United for Separation of Church and State into the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I would like now to yield to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth, who is the ranking member of the Budget Committee and one of the most knowledgeable members of the House.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized, but for how much time?
2 minutes, please.
2 minutes. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate my friend yielding time. This is a horror show today. This is a horror show debate. This is a horror show process. But it's a disaster for the American people. The bill we are debating today will abandon millions of American families. It showers the wealthy and corporations with massive tax cuts and adds $1.5 trillion to our deficits. The top 1% get this massive payout in the neighborhood of $500 billion. Hard-working families get pocket change. But millions don't even get that. In fact, 36 million middle-class families will pay more in taxes because of this bill. Our Republican colleagues will be taking money out of our pockets and these pockets of these families to give more tax cuts to the rich. But it doesn't stop there. It never does. Because this is part of a dangerous three-step process that we've seen, unfortunately, far too often. First step, Republicans enact massive tax cuts for the rich, claiming they'll generate enough growth to pay for themselves. I know my Republican colleagues desperately want the American people to believe this is what will happen, but the record is clear. It failed in the 80s. It failed in the 2000s. It was an epic failure in Kansas. This is about politics, not reality for them, which brings us to step two. Once these cuts fail to produce the growth that they promise, Republicans will shriek about the impending doom of high deficits and debt. They'll quickly move to step three, demanding cuts in vital programs that benefit working families throughout our country. We've seen this act before. As I said before, it is a horror show. There's a reason why a lot of people are looking at this and saying this is the great tax scam of 2017, because it is the great tax scam of 2017. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield 3 minutes to one of the key leaders of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Rice.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The American dream, it's what separates us from the rest of the world. It promises that with hard work and determination, you can improve your station in life and that your children have the opportunity for a better life than yours. But for many in the generation coming of age in the last decade, the American dream has been a little tarnished and just out of reach. The last time we did tax reform was 30 years ago. At that time, we were the world's uncontested economic leader. Our economic system and tax code were competitive, but for decades we've sat by as the world passed us by. In 1990, the middle class was about 50% of American families. Today, only 40%. And today, the middle class makes just about the same take-home pay as it did in 1990. When we all worry about income disparity and the gulf between the rich and the poor in this country, this is the source of the problem. The American middle class is smaller and has not had a raise in 30 years. How could this happen? It has everything to do with a bloated, over-regulating and overtaxing federal government, a government that sucks the life out of the economy and forces our companies, our innovators, and our job creators out of our country to survive. Some folks say it doesn't matter that we have the highest business tax rate in the world. That's not why our companies left. They say those jobs aren't coming back. Well, I say the outdated tax code is an anchor around the neck of our businesses, our innovators, and the American middle class. I say the American worker can compete with anyone on a level playing field if we just get government off their back. Since January, we've been working to correct that. We've made dramatic steps in reducing regulation. You can already see the economic lift. Today, we undertake a tax cut which will restore economic growth, put more take-home pay in the pockets of hardworking Americans, and restore opportunity for a generation of Americans. It will bring American jobs back. It will grow our middle class. And finally, after 30 years, our middle class will get the pay raise it deserves. If you really wish to grow our economy, you should vote for this bill. If you really wish to give the middle class a pay raise, you should vote for this bill. If you really wish to reduce income disparity, you should vote for this bill. If you really wish to give hope to Americans who've given up and left the workforce and reduce crime and addiction in this country, you should vote for this bill. If you want America to have the economic strength to remain a force of peace and stability in the world, you should vote for this bill. And finally, if you truly believe what Thomas Jefferson said 240 years ago, that all men are created equal and that they are entitled to pursue their own happiness, you should vote for this bill. I yield back.
Chair would advise both sides of the time remaining in debate, 26 3/4 for the gentleman from Texas and 25 1/4 for the gentleman from Massachusetts, who's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan.
Gentleman from New Mexico is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this bill put forward by congressional Republicans isn't a tax plan. It's a tax scam. Republicans are going to borrow money on the backs of working families to give a tax cut to corporations in the top 1%. This will increase taxes on the middle class. This will add to our nation's debt and pass the bill to our children. This Republican tax scam hurts seniors and families with long-term medical needs by eliminating the medical expense deduction that 9 million Americans and nearly 120,000 people in my home state of New Mexico depend upon. Destroying the medical expense deduction delivers a staggering blow to New Mexico families. Listen to this story sent to me by Lisa, a constituent from northern New Mexico. My husband and I are lifelong native New Mexicans who grew up here, went to college here, and have opened and operated our 2 businesses in our home state. We are the proud parents of 2 wonderful children. New Mexico is our home, and we're proud to live here, contribute to our state's economy, and realize our version of the American dream. Like most families today, life isn't always easy. The kids and I have medically complex conditions which require expensive medications, and my husband and I struggle with student loan debt, housing and transportation costs, and making a good life for our family. We incur $5,000 to $7,000 in out-of-pocket medical costs each year. Without the medical expense deductions, I'm not sure we could continue to meet the demands of raising healthy, happy children while keeping our businesses going and growing. For us, this deduction is a lifeline, and the thought of losing that lifeline means we could drown in debt. That's not the American dream. That's a nightmare. This is real, and this is personal to people all across the country. Let's vote this bill down today and come back. Work in a bipartisan fashion. Work with our ranking member, Richie Neal, and come up with real tax reform that puts American working families first, Mr. Speaker. Let's do the right thing today and put hardworking families first with our decision today.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, please yield 3 minutes to a key leader of the Tax Policy Subcommittee, a fellow Texan, Mr. March.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership on this issue. It's an honor for me to serve on the committee. I rise today in support of H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This is a historic opportunity to reject the status quo and provide real tax relief to families, individuals, and businesses in my district. America's tax code is broken. It is uncompetitive for American companies, and it's unfair to American workers. The American people deserve a tax code that works for them, not one that works for special interests in Washington. They deserve a tax code that rewards their lifetime of hard work, not one that squeezes and depletes their savings. And they deserve a tax code that prioritizes their goals, not penalizes their success. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act creates a tax code that is focused on growth, fairness, and a booming economy for everyone. The reforms in this bill level the playing field for small businesses in my district in North Texas around the DFW airport, giving them an opportunity to grow and hire more people and spend more money in our economy, and allow the hardworking taxpayers that I represent to keep more of their paycheck and increase their family's budget. I would like to thank the chairman for allowing me to represent the views of my constituents throughout the process of the committee work, and I urge my colleagues to take advantage of this very historic opportunity and vote in favor of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I yield my time back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 3 minutes to a very thoughtful member of the Ways and Means Committee, Ms. Sanchez, for 3 minutes.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 1, or better known as the GOP tax scam. This bill provides tax cuts for corporations and multimillionaires at the expense of hard-working middle-class families. Massive corporate tax cuts do not guarantee job growth or higher wages. The only thing guaranteed is the $2.3 trillion that this scam adds to the deficit. Democrats are serious about passing comprehensive tax reform that is fair and that puts a little more money in the pockets of working Americans. This fiasco of a bill is not fair. Corporations get a massive 15% tax cut, but what do working families get? They get nickeled and dimed. Despite student loan debt surpassing $1 trillion, this bill eliminates the student loan interest deduction, which only allows those earning $80,000 or less to claim it in the first place, squarely hurting middle-class Americans who are trying to pay off debt, save for a home, or buy a new car. Teachers will no longer be able to deduct expenses for school supplies that they purchase with their own money for their classrooms. Yet corporations are able to deduct the cost of those same supplies that they purchase. Seniors and people with chronic illnesses would no longer be able to deduct some of the cost of their treatment. And at a time when many families are feeling the pressures of affording care for their children and their aging parents, this bill takes money right out of their pockets. Under this bill, 29 million households would lose the property tax deduction. 80% of middle-class homeowners would lose, compared with just 13% of high-income earners. Does that sound fair? Finally, the elimination of the state and local income tax deduction disproportionately impacts middle-income families, especially those in California, whose residents would see an overall net tax increase of $12.1 billion. The tax code is a reflection of our values. The Republicans have clearly chosen who they serve, the wealthy and corporations. But I'm concerned about the 36 million Americans who will see a tax increase, teachers and their students, and people with pre-existing conditions. My colleagues, I urge you to vote no on this disaster of a bill. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 2 letters, one by SEIU and one by the AFL-CIO, both in opposition to this bill.
Without objection. Gentleman from Texas.
I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina and our Chief Deputy Whip, Mr. McHenry.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee for his hard work and his effort, his staff's effort, and his committee members' effort to put this great bill on the floor today. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act is a vitally important bill. This will help all Americans' lives for the better. The name fits for this bill as well. It truly is a tax cut for American working families, and it creates good-paying jobs. The bill is the result of over 3 years of hard work here in the House of Representatives. It has been clear for years that our tax code is broken. We all agree on that. But, simply put, it does not work for the vast majority of the American people. And what we do is simplify the tax code. More Americans will be able to take a standard deduction, file on a postcard their tax return. Simplifies the process. Importantly, it makes us more competitive internationally so we don't lose jobs to overseas companies. That makes us stronger as a nation. And at the same time, it helps small businesses compete with those large businesses, with those global businesses, and make sure that our main streets are strong in America. This is a very good bill. It is a very good bill, well contemplated, and will have a great impact on working families. The bill helps families in my district in particular. The Tax Foundation says that average middle-class families in my district in western North Carolina are going to see a $2,400 increase in their take-home pay. That's real money for working Americans. It's real money for North Carolinians as well. The bill also helps small businesses by reducing their tax rates and allowing them to create more good-paying jobs. We need that. Small businesses are the lifeblood of western North Carolina's communities. We need them strengthened. The same Tax Foundation study estimates that this bill will create nearly 1 million new jobs nationwide, including more than 30,000 in North Carolina alone. Now, there's a great debate in this body about the approach we took on this bill. There's a fundamental disagreement between the two parties here. My colleagues on the left want more power, more expenditures from government, and want to take more from the American people in order to pay for that. We believe on the Republican side of the aisle that American families should be able to keep more of what they earn, make more decisions for themselves, empower communities, empower small businesses, and make us more competitive and make us stronger. I urge my colleagues to vote for this bill to send a strong message that we in the House of Representatives have a strong tax package for the American people. And I look forward to getting this bill signed into law before Christmas. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Speaker, I want to yield the balance of my time to manage the bill to Mr. Larson.
Without objection, the gentleman from Connecticut will control the balance of the time, which is 20 3/4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize the chairman of the Democratic Caucus, a great leader on the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Crowley.
For how much time?
For 3 minutes.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding me this time. I had to give it to Speaker Ryan and to President Trump and all of my Republican colleagues. I have to give them their due. They announced earlier this year they would cut taxes for corporate special interests. And today, they're following through on that promise. The problem is, in order to do it, they are raising taxes on middle-class families. And don't take my word for it. Listen to them. The Republicans started this process by saying that every American, everyone in America, will get a tax cut. Now they're saying, on average, people will get a tax cut. And even that isn't correct. It is time to be honest with the American people. What we have before us today isn't a bill. It is a scam. A scam that will hurt homeowners in Irvine, California, in Ms. Walters' district. A scam that will hurt seniors in Lancaster, New York, in Congressman Chris Collins' district. A scam that will hurt students in Toms River, New Jersey, in Tom MacArthur's district. A scam that will hurt veterans in Barrington, Illinois, in Pete Roskam's district. And a scam that will absolutely hurt the middle class in every congressional district in our country. 36 million people, to be exact. In my district, a quarter of all homeowners will lose the ability to deduct their taxes. But corporate special interests, they can still deduct their taxes under the GOP plan. 20,000 students in Queens and the Bronx, in my district, will lose one of the most effective ways to pay down their student loan debt. That's right, Republicans are eliminating the ability to deduct the interest on student loan payments. This scam eliminates the assistance for small businesses to hire veterans here at home. But it continues the tax breaks to ship American jobs overseas. And yes, you heard that correctly. Republicans and President Trump are doling out tax breaks for companies to move overseas, but will take away benefits to hire American veterans right here at home. These aren't the values of my constituents, but apparently they're the values of Speaker Ryan, President Trump, and the entire Congressional Republican caucus. So how did we end up here? It's because when Republicans sat down to write this bill, they didn't have the average American in mind. They had their wealthy donors and corporate friends in mind. Republicans started tax reform with this question: how do we get the corporate rate down? Democrats would have started with the question, how do we raise up the middle class? Republicans wrote a bill, a tax scam, that benefits people who own second and third homes, but left behind average American homeowners. They left behind teachers who use their own money to buy school supplies. They left average Americans behind because they never had you in mind to begin with. So on behalf of hardworking people,
You gentlemen, 15 more seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 15 seconds.
So on behalf of hard-working Americans throughout this country, I say vote no on H.R. 1. Vote no on H.R. 1%. I yield back the balance of
Gentleman from Texas.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 1 minute from the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank you, Chairman Brady, for your efforts to get this tax reform bill done. You know, our outdated and uncompetitive tax code has led to slow economic growth over the past decade in America. Today, we're taking an important step to fix that. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will reform the tax code and help foster economic growth. For more than 3 decades, families have paid a growing cost for our country's increasingly complex and burdensome tax code that's chock full of special interest loopholes. This isn't fair. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act will simplify the process of filing taxes by doubling the size of the standard deduction and remove the need for millions to itemize their deductions. And it will provide tax cuts to millions of middle-income working families. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act also includes many tax reform for businesses in order to spur economic growth. The bill makes it easier for entrepreneurs to start businesses and to bring down the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20% to be in line with our competitors around the world. This will help spur economic growth by encouraging businesses to move their capital and jobs back to the United States, and will help lower prices for Americans, who are the ones who ultimately pay for high corporate taxes through higher prices. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, the son of a preacher man, and who always speaks truth to power, Jim Clyburn.
For what amount of time?
3 minutes.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my good friend, Mr. Lawson, for yielding me this time. Mr. Speaker, the bill before us today is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Republicans can dream, dress it up, and call it good names, but that will not change the fact that H.R. 1 is a scam that will be perpetrated on America's middle-income families. This bill will make it harder to own a home, raise a family, and afford a post-secondary education. It should come as no surprise that President Trump wanted to call the bill, quote unquote, cut, cut, cut. That would have been apropos. The first cut is for him and his family. The second cut is for his wealthy friends. And the third cut is for large corporations and businesses that ship jobs overseas. H.R. 1 certainly does not cut taxes for middle-income families or small businesses. In fact, it does just the opposite. Under H.R. 1, millions of Americans, middle-income families, will pay more, 500,000 of whom live in South Carolina. Middle-income families and first-time homeowners who utilize mortgage interest reductions will pay more because the GOP scam lowers the cap, making home ownership more expensive and driving down property taxes for current homeowners. Middle-income families with children in college or recent graduates will pay more because the GOP scam eliminates deductions for interest on student loans. This includes 12 million American families, 156,000 of whom are South Carolinians. Middle-income families struggling to pay costly medical bills will pay more because the GOP scam shamefully eliminates that deductibility. This includes 9 million American families, and nearly 140,000 live in South Carolina. Middle-income families with children in daycare, nursery, or aging parents will pay more because the GOP scam eliminates the deductions for dependent care assistance. Middle-income school teachers will pay more because the GOP scam eliminates their ability to deduct the cost of the supplies they purchase for their classrooms. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1 is an attack on middle-income families. It will subject the good people of this country to a second Great Recession and raise taxes on 36 million middle-income households. According to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, this GOP tax scam will add $1.5 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years and trigger massive funding cuts across the government next year. And Medicare will see a $25 billion per year cut. I'll yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes from the gentleman from Maryland, Dr. Harris.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I wish to engage the chairman from Texas in a colloquy. We should not be satisfied with the historically low economic growth rates of the past decade. This tax reform bill that creates jobs, increases paychecks, grows our economy, and increases American competitiveness can help Maryland families and businesses. The bill we're considering today has many positive elements that will benefit our country in many ways. However, I am concerned about its impact on some of my constituents in Maryland who pay high state and local income taxes. I ask you as the Ways and Means Chairman to continue to work with me to ensure that families and job creators in my district will all be helped by this legislation, and I yield to the Chairman.
I want to thank my friend from Maryland for yielding. The intent of our tax reform bill is to achieve tax relief for individuals at every income level in every state. I agree with the gentleman. There are still some areas where we will and can make improvements. The gentleman's willing to help us continue to move this process forward. Today, I'm happy to commit to working with you to ensure we reach a positive outcome for your constituents as we reconcile our differences with the Senate. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding back, and thank you for agreeing to work with me on this as we move forward. And I'll be voting for this bill today and urge my colleagues to vote for this bill to increase American competitiveness. I yield back.
Gentleman from Connecticut.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the lead Democrat on the Foreign Affairs Committee, a gentleman from New York who understands the impact of double taxation from a donor state, Elliot Ingo.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Someone near and dear to me once said that the Republican Party is the party of rich men and women, and the Democratic Party is the party of working men and women. Nothing proves that more than this tax scam today. I've been around here a long time. Of all the bills I've seen, this is one of the worst bills I have ever seen on the floor of this House. It's actually a disaster. It raises taxes on the middle class, on millions of families across America. It adds trillions to the debt to give tax cuts to America's wealthy families and corporations while stripping credits and deductions from middle-class families. Whatever happened to the fiscal responsibility of the Republican Party? This budget ransacks Medicare and Medicaid of $1.5 trillion, and the GOP will use the new deficits to justify further devastating Medicare and Medicaid. And finally, it's a terrible disaster for my New York constituents who already pay their fair share of taxes. New York is a donor state, meaning that we pay more to the federal government than what we get in return. This will reduce or eliminate key deductions, such as curbing or eliminating the deductibility of state and local taxes, mortgage interest deductions, college debt, student loans. We're a high-tax state. This is a disaster. Scrap this disaster. Go back to the drawing board and write a bill which is fair to middle-class taxpayers.
Gentleman from Texas.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I reserve this
Gentleman from Texas reserves his time. Gentleman from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now recognize for 1 minute the gentlelady from Texas, the voice of Houston, Sheila Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. Speaker, this is not the American dream tax plan. This is the American nightmare, a tax scam of the worst proportion. With over 8,000 of my constituents last evening on a teleconference town hall meeting, overwhelmingly they disagreed with a tax plan that cuts Medicare or Medicaid to finance tax cuts, eliminates the mortgage tax deduction so that those who are suffering from Hurricane Harvey, trying to rebuild their lives, seeking a new home, cannot in fact deduct their mortgage. The same thing with the 200,000 Texans who are going to pay more because we're eliminating the deduction for state and local taxes and eliminating deductions for student loans, casualty losses. By the year next year, $25 billion in Social Security cuts. And my seniors on the phone last night asked me about those cuts. They asked me about the medical expenses cuts for seniors. All of that is eliminating. This will be a plan that will show no growth. The tax policy, the neutral tax policy entity said you'll get no growth in wages, and you'll send jobs overseas in waves. It's a tax scam, and it is an American nightmare. Vote against this tax scam.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve this time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Connecticut.
We will reserve as well.
Gentleman from Connecticut reserves his time.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. So I note that constituents in the 18th District of Texas, past Speaker, that average family will see a tax cut of nearly $1,000. In Texas, we'll grow 81,000 new jobs and see higher paychecks as a result of this tax reform bill. We are proposing a tax code so fair and simple, 9 out of 10 Americans will be able to file using a simple postcard system. There's a fairness and equality that each American, knowing what each other's deductions are, because we have exactly the same ones. This simplicity, this fairness, these larger paychecks, this is what the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is all about. I reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves his time. Gentleman from Connecticut.
We continue to reserve.
Gentleman from Connecticut continues to reserve. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to the leader of the Republican conference, the gentlelady from Washington, Kathy McMorris Rogers.
Gentlelady from Washington is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, and a big thank you to the chairman for his tremendous leadership on this important legislation this morning. I'm proud to rise in support of enacting tax reform, tax relief to millions of Americans. We've been waiting a long time, more than 30 years, and while everything else has changed over 30 years, our tax code, unfortunately, has only gotten old, outdated, bigger, more complicated. It's become a burden that we're going to lift. Now, there are some defenders of the status quo who think that the tax code is just fine. Well, that's not what the American people sent us here to do, to defend the status quo. We're here to do the big things. Our plan rewrites the tax code to put American families first, including families who have children with disabilities. For these families who may have saved for their son or daughter's college tuition, which is no longer needed, our plan carries on the legacy of the ABLE Act by allowing them to roll over from a 529 account to a 529A account, an ABLE account, to pay for things like medical bills or workforce development instead. With this bill, we're making it easier for everyone to reach their full potential. We're lifting the tax burden for everyday hardworking Americans. An extra $1,182 for middle-income families in places like Eastern Washington could make all the difference between living paycheck to paycheck and saving for retirement or making that car payment. Mr. Speaker, this is a historic moment, and I urge all my colleagues to join me on the right side of history by voting in favor of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Let's help our hardworking men and women all across this country, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Connecticut.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize the gentlelady from Texas for a unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. I ask unanimous consent to place into the record the Washington Post op-ed, The Republican Tax Plan's 5 Worst Dangers by Secretary Rubin, dated November 15, 2017.
Without objection. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 1 is postponed. When debate resumes, the time remaining will be 17 minutes for the gentleman from Texas, 12 and a half minutes for the gentleman from Connecticut. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess subject to the call of the Chair.